The December afternoon air was thick with a dense gray fog, cloaking the quiet suburban neighborhood like a forgotten blanket. Lucas Thorne's car sped down the oak-lined road, the only trace of its passing the soft crunch of tires on the cold asphalt. His face hardened, cold with storm-gray eyes showed no emotion, even as memories of this place clawed at the edges of his mind. Thorne Manor loomed behind the wrought iron gates, massive, grim, their rusted edges etched with the weight of time and sin. Lucas rolled down the window, staring at the house in silence. For years he'd avoided thinking about it, this place that held the stains of his father, Harold Thorne's unforgivable legacy. But now with Harold gone, Lucas had returned for one reason only: to tear it all down, to erase the past and build something new, something clean. He stepped out of the car, adjusted the collar of his overcoat, his breath rising in ghostly wisps in the cold air. Beside the iron gate stood Walter, the old gatekeeper who had served the Thorne family for nearly 40 years, still there, like a familiar shadow. His white hair fluttered in the wind, hands trembling as they gripped his wooden cane. "Good afternoon, Lucas," he said softly, his voice mingling with the wind. "Hello, Walter," Lucas replied curtly, eyes never leaving the house. Walter looked at him, worry etched deep into his wrinkled eyes, something more than sadness, something close to fear. "Are you really going to?" Lucas didn't answer. He reached into his coat pocket for the keys, about to unlock the gate. Suddenly, Walter's shout split the stillness. "Don't go in that house!" Lucas froze, his hand hovering above the lock. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, only the sound of wind rustling through the trees, and his own pounding heartbeat remained. Walter stepped forward, placing himself between Lucas and the gate, his gaze firm, hands trembling but determined. "Don't go in there, Lucas. Some things are better left buried." Lucas gave a bitter, dry chuckle. "I came back to end the past, Walter, not to run from it." Walter shook his head, his voice suddenly low. "Sometimes what's most terrifying isn't the darkness outside, but the secrets rotting inside that house." Lucas didn't respond. He pushed open the gate. The old man stepped aside, powerless, still muttering under his breath. "If you must, please be careful." The wind swept through, carrying the damp scent of decaying leaves of a childhood distorted. Lucas walked into the manor grounds. Every step on the gravel felt like pressing down on fragments of broken memories, the remnants of a family that never truly was. He remembered the cold dinners, his mother sitting silently by the window, his father either absent or erupting in inexplicable anger. No one had ever lived in this house, they had merely survived. The grand wooden door appeared, intricately carved but peeling with age, like a wound left open. Lucas touched the doorknob, pausing as a wave of unease swept over him. He opened it. The air inside was musty, laced with rot and dust. The interior was dark, the only light a faint gray sliver from cobweb-laced windows. His leather shoes echoed hollowly on the wooden floor, each step tapping into distant memories. The grand foyer was thick with dust, velvet drapes hanging like years of suffocating sorrow. The spiral staircase curled upward to the second floor, where Lucas once played hide-and-seek with shadows. At the end of the hallway stood a sleek black piano, the only gift his mother had ever received, now covered with a yellowing white cloth. Lucas scanned the house. Everything seemed untouched, but something felt off. The space didn't feel entirely abandoned. A thin jacket was draped over the back of a chair in the living room corner. A pair of small shoes neatly placed by the doormat. A bowl of fruit sat wilted but with fresh indentations on an apple's skin. Someone had been here, or still was. A chill crawled down Lucas's spine. He walked toward the kitchen, where the door stood ajar. The dishes were neatly stacked, a teapot still warm to the touch. The sink sparkled too clean for a house supposedly left to rot. "Is anyone here?" he called, his voice echoing into the vast space. No reply. He returned to the living room, scanning for signs. His mind reeled who would be living here, unnoticed, uninvited. Was this some strange prank by Walter? No, Walter couldn't lie if his life depended on it. Lucas climbed the stairs. Each step creaked like a whisper from the past. The hallway stretched dark and quiet to the master bedroom. His hand trailed the wall until it reached the door to his mother's room. The door was ajar. A cold breeze slipped through the gap, carrying the faint scent of jasmine, his mother's perfume. Lucas pushed the door open. The room was immaculate bed made, windows slightly open to the air. On the vanity lay an old diary. Lucas reached toward it when behind him, a soft sound like footsteps on the wooden floor. He spun around, eyes sharp, ready to confront whoever it was. But only his own reflection stared back from the window pane. Silence. He slowly stepped out, checking each room, the guest room, his father's study, the dining hall. All showed signs of care, swept floors, open windows. This wasn't a squatter. Someone lived here. Suddenly, downstairs, a soft clinking glass against glass. Lucas rushed down the stairs, stormed into the kitchen, and caught a fleeting silhouette behind the curtain. He stopped, voice cold. "Come out! I don't have time for trespassers." The curtain was drawn aside. A woman in her late 20s, dark brown hair neatly tied back, calm, steady eyes locked on him. She wore a simple gray dress, a dish towel still in her hands. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne," she said, voice calm and unwavering. Lucas blinked, surprised, but kept his composure. "Who are you? Who gave you permission to be here?" She set the towel down and faced him. "I didn't come in. I've been here. My name is Lila. My mother used to live in this house, and according to the will, I have the right to stay until I recover the memories I need." Lucas frowned, feeling as if he had just stumbled into a play without knowing the script. "The will? Who was your mother?" "Her name was Miriam," Lila answered, her eyes never leaving his. "Mr. Walter might still have the original copy of the will." That name Miriam drifted through Lucas's memory like a cold wind. He had never heard his father mention it, but a vague recollection stirred of a woman's sad eyes, of piano music drifting through the night. Lucas's voice turned sharp. "I am the sole heir to this house. I'll call the lawyer, and you'll have to leave." Lila simply shrugged as if accustomed to rejection. "Go ahead, but before you do, ask Mr. Walter, or maybe take a closer look at who's really trespassing here." Silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock and the tense gaze locked between two people, one who came to erase the past and one who returned to reclaim it. Lucas clenched his fists, struggling to stay composed. He turned, pulled out his phone, but hesitated. His mind swirled with unanswered questions about Miriam, about Lila, about the secret still pulsing through the walls of this house. The fading light outside turned silver gray, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Lucas looked around the manor and realized this house, sealed away for so long, still breathed, and that breath no longer belonged to him alone. Outside, Walter stood silently in the yard, eyes fixed on the door. His voice echoed again, softer now, but louder in Lucas's mind. "Don't go in that house if you're not ready to face the truth." Lucas lifted his gaze, facing Lila, the darkness and the past, knowing that the decision to demolish this house would never be simple again. You're watching Soul Stories, where every tale whispers of love, healing, and hope. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life, and that love often arrives when we least expect it, don't forget to subscribe and be part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. The golden afternoon light spilled through the aged windows of Thorne Manor, filtering through heavy drapes and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Lucas still stood in the living room, feeling both unsettled and strangely out of place. In front of him was a woman whose calm eyes concealed a fog of the past. Lila neither bowed her head nor looked away, nor did she show any fear in the face of the new owner's icy demeanor. She stood tall, composed, and steady, as if she had long prepared for this moment. Her beauty wasn't the kind that flustered men easily. It was gentle, pure, and quiet, like a fading melody in the late afternoon. Lucas broke the silence first. Arms crossed, eyes sharp as blades, he said, "So you're living here. No one informed me this house is legally my property." Lila replied, her voice even and composed, "Perhaps Mr. Walter forgot to tell you. I'm not trespassing. I'm here legally, at least, until I fulfill what my mother left behind." Lucas frowned. "Who is your mother? I don't recall any names in the will outside my own family." Lila gave a small nod, her gaze still calm, though there was a deep, unreadable pool behind her eyes. My mother was Miriam. She once lived here, and her will granted me the right to stay, to uncover the memories of her life within these walls. Lucas cut in coldly. This house belonged to my family, and I don't recall anyone named Miriam ever living here, aside from some baseless rumors. Lila didn't flinch. Whether you remember or not, the truth still remains in this place. I didn't come here to claim anything. I came to understand what happened to my mother, her youth, her love, and the things she never could say while she was alive. Lucas shook his head in frustration and pulled out his phone. I'll call my lawyer. Whatever documents you have, I'll take care of it. Lila met his gaze. There was no pleading in her eyes, only a soft, firm sadness. You can call your lawyer or you can ask Walter. I'm here for the truth, not for the inheritance. The air seemed to freeze. Lucas tightened his grip on the phone, a strange discomfort rising in his chest. All his life he had solved problems with logic, power, and the law. He despised ambiguity, emotions, memories, mercy. Yet something in this woman's quiet, deep eyes made it difficult to look away. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Walter appeared, stepping between the two, his aging eyes moving from Lucas to Lila, as if weighing something important. What's going on, sir? Walter asked, his voice raspy but carrying the weight of someone who knew more than he let on. Lucas turned, annoyed. Walter, did you know about this? Why didn't you tell me someone was living here? Walter sighed, his gaze never leaving Lucas. She's not a stranger, not to this house. Her mother was once a part of it, even if only briefly. You should hear her out before making any decisions. Lucas was nearly out of patience. You're the caretaker. Your job is to report everything to me, not let strangers stay without permission. Walter didn't back down. His eyes were unusually firm. I did what I believed was right. There are things you don't know, Mr. Lucas. Things that were never written in wills or spoken at dinner. But they still live here, within these walls. Lucas's voice tightened as he growled. Then tell me, what am I supposed to hear from a complete stranger? Walter looked at Lila and gave a slow nod. Go ahead, let him decide for himself. Lila sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands resting on her knees. Her posture was composed, though a flicker of nervousness shimmered in her eyes. I was born in the neighboring city, but I never knew who my father was. My mother Miriam always said her life both began and ended in this house. After she passed, I discovered a letter and a will. She asked me to return here, to uncover the truth not just about her past, but about the long silence that followed. Lucas's face remained stoic, but something in his gaze softened. You came here because of a deathbed wish? Lila nodded. I've spent half my life carrying faded memories and watching my mother cry by the piano at night. I didn't expect a welcome, only a short time to walk through this house and find the pieces she left behind. Lucas turned away, looking up at the portrait of his father on the wall. Harold Thorne's face still stern, eyes cold and ever watchful. He recalled his mother's broken sentences, her silent evenings, locking herself in her room, her cryptic mentions of a ghost in the house, of a betrayal no one dared name. The room grew heavy with silence. For the first time, Lucas didn't know how to respond. He looked at Lila and saw no threat in her, no trace of the greed that usually accompanied inheritance disputes. Only a woman searching for her mother and perhaps for herself. Walter's gentle voice broke Lucas's thoughts. Sir, I know you want to be done with the past. I know you want to tear everything down and start over. But not everything can be handled with a sledgehammer or a lawyer. Some secrets can only be resolved with listening and respect. Lucas stood still, the phone still clenched in his hand, but he no longer felt like calling anyone. He quietly looked at Lila, a stranger with a face marked by time and gentle sorrow. Lila offered a faint smile, barely noticeable, but enough to flicker in Lucas's eyes. I only ask for a little time. If you prefer, I won't step outside this house or touch anything without your permission. But please, don't stop me from learning the truth about my mother. Lucas stared at her for a long moment. Inside him stirred a vague discomfort, not anger, not sympathy, but something else. Something about her eyes reminded him of himself as a child. Lost, always searching for answers to a nameless coldness that haunted his family. Finally, Lucas nodded, his voice low and brief. You can stay, but everything you do must go through me and Walter. I'll review the legal records regarding your mother's will. If I find any forgery, you'll be out of here immediately. Lila nodded. Gratitude flickered in her eyes, but she asked for nothing more. Thank you. Lucas turned and headed upstairs, leaving Lila and Walter in the living room. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning with questions. Who was Miriam? What was her connection to his father? And why had this woman appeared just as he was ready to bury the past? Walter watched Lucas disappear up the staircase, then turned to Lila and said softly, Don't be afraid. This house has seen more than you think. But I believe, if anyone can bring the truth into the light, it's you. Outside, the evening light had faded completely. Inside the sealed house, for the first time in years, 3 people stood at 3 corners, each carrying an old wound, an unanswered question, and a quiet sense that the shadows of the past were beginning to stir. Thorne Manor at night was eerily quiet. After the tense conversation with Lila and Walter's warning, Lucas could barely sleep. He wandered through the shadowed hallways, feeling lost and stifled. Every step on the wooden floor seemed to stir a layer of dust from the past he had tried so hard to forget. He stopped in front of his mother's old study. The small room sat tucked at the end of the second-floor hallway, directly across from his father's reading room, 2 worlds that had always run parallel but never touched. The room hadn't been used in years. The lock was still an old brass one. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out the small key he had kept as a memento, slowly unlocking the door. A faint scent of dried lavender lingered in the air, reminding him of childhood nights when his mother held him close and read stories by the window. The soft yellow light of the desk lamp glowed over the worn wooden desk, where books were neatly stacked beside a music box and a few faded black and white photographs. Lucas sank into the chair and opened the desk drawer. His hand brushed against a strange crevice at the bottom. After a bit of gentle twisting, the drawer base popped up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a weathered leather-bound journal, tied shut with a pale blue ribbon. His hand trembled. He recognized the handwriting. It was his mother's. The soft, slanted script was soaked in time. On the first page was a small inscription, For Lucas, if you're brave enough to seek the truth. His heart tightened. Lucas turned the pages, reading the words his mother had written in sleepless nights. I once loved Harold. I thought love could change a man. I was wrong. When Miriam appeared in this house, I knew her presence would bring pain to both of us. Miriam was young, passionate about art, her eyes full of life. At first, Harold adored her, showered her with affection. But the truth is, he only saw her as a possession, a means to an end. Lucas swallowed hard and continued reading. I never dared to ask about the shady deals between Harold and his business partners. But that night, after the music died, I heard Miriam crying in the hallway. Harold had handed her over to a foreign investor as a living gift, forcing her into a private party in exchange for the largest investment deal he'd ever craved. I heard Miriam begging him, crying about her dreams, her shame. But Harold simply said, Everything has a price, even your freedom. I couldn't stop my tears. I couldn't save her. I was just another prisoner in this house. Harold controlled everything: my schedule, my wardrobe, my friends, even how I raised my son. I didn't dare leave. If I did, I'd lose Lucas. That was the price I paid to live as a shadow, without name, without voice. Lucas closed his eyes, struggling to contain the flood of emotion. The image of the father he once admired, once idolized, crumbled in a single moment. 2 women, his mother and Lila's, had both loved Harold. Both believed they were chosen. But in the end, both were victims, each in their own tragic way. He turned the next pages, the handwriting now shakier. After that night, Miriam vanished. But I knew she had never been forgiven. Weeks later, I heard she was pregnant. Harold was furious. He ordered her to terminate the pregnancy. Miriam refused. She chose the risk, clinging to a final thread of hope. Harold fabricated a theft, accused her of stealing heirlooms, forced her out, and handed her a large sum of money to silence her. She returned it. He even threatened legal action if she ever came back. I once asked him how he could be so cruel. He only laughed. Nothing in this world is free. The weak must learn to disappear. I was afraid and I was a coward in my silence. The last lines were smudged with tears, too blurred to read. Lucas buried his head in the journal, his shoulders shaking with rage, grief, and a crushing sense of guilt. A while later, a soft knock came at the door. Walter stood at the threshold, his face grave. "You've read it, haven't you, sir?" he asked gently, as if afraid to break the fragile stillness. Lucas looked up, eyes bloodshot. "It's all true, isn't it, Walter?" Walter slowly stepped forward, sitting across from him, his gaze distant. "I saw it all, Mr. Lucas. Miriam. She was the most vibrant soul I've ever known. She loved to dance, loved her freedom, dreamed of becoming a great artist, and she loved Harold. But Harold didn't see her as a person. To him, people were just chess pieces to achieve a larger goal." Lucas remained silent, clutching the journal tightly. "He gave her to a foreign investor for a contract?" he asked, voice cracking. Walter nodded, his eyes misting. "That night was a grand reception. After the party, Harold took Miriam upstairs to a private room with the investor. I heard her crying, begging, but no one dared to interfere. The next morning she left the room with swollen eyes, but her head held high. I asked if she needed help. She said, 'I don't want pity, but I will never forgive those who took my voice.'" Lucas clenched his fists, his voice hoarse. "And the baby?" Walter closed his eyes, the painful memory etched into every line of his aged face. "When Harold found out she was pregnant, he exploded. He wanted no ties, no scandal. He sent his private doctor to force her into an abortion, threatened her with police action if she didn't leave. But Miriam chose to keep the baby. She left, refused the money, took only a small suitcase, and disappeared into the night." "The theft, that was staged by my father too?" Lucas asked, voice cold and bitter. Walter nodded again. "He didn't want any trace left. He claimed expensive jewelry had gone missing, blamed it all on Miriam, and hired a lawyer to threaten her if she ever returned. He wired hush money, she returned every cent. She walked away with dignity under pouring rain." Lucas choked. He no longer recognized the man he had once worshipped. Disgust surged within him, shattering the values he had been taught since childhood. After a long silence, Lucas asked quietly, "Do you know what happened to Miriam after that?" Walter shook his head. "I heard she had the baby in a small town, raised the child alone, then vanished. No one in this house ever mentioned her again, but I've always regretted not doing more." Lucas sat still, the ticking of the room's clock loud and merciless. In that moment, every reason he had returned to demolish, to erase the past, felt meaningless. He realized that some stains can't be removed with bricks or money. Some spirits haunt not because of what they did, but because of what was done to them. He closed the journal and looked at Walter, his voice steady and more resolute than ever. "I won't let this stay buried. Even if it costs me my reputation, I'll bring the truth to light." Walter nodded, his eyes wet with emotion and hope. "Only the truth can free the souls still trapped here, Mr. Lucas. And only courage can save you from your father's shadow." Outside the window, the night remained thick and silent, but somewhere within the sealed house, a new door had just been opened. The chime of the antique clock echoed through the grand hall, stretching each second into a heavy silence inside the cold mansion. That morning, the sky was weighed down with dull, leaden clouds, and thick snow blanketed the rows of oaks outside the window. Lucas sat quietly at the desk, Lila beside him, two people, two souls, bound by the same question neither dared to speak aloud. On the desk sat a sealed envelope, a DNA test kit, two birth certificates, one for Lucas, one for Lila, and a test registration form addressed to a private laboratory in the state's largest city. It all lay there like a silent verdict hanging between them. Lucas picked up the fountain pen and signed the consent form. His hand trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "If we don't do this, we'll never know the truth." Leela gave a small nod. Her loosely tied brown hair brushed her shoulder. Her face had softened, no longer sharp but calm, like it had dissolved into morning mist. She took the paper and read every word carefully. When she signed, her fingertip trembled barely, but Lucas noticed. "Are you scared?" he asked, unexpectedly gentle. Lila looked at him, her eyes glowing faintly like a candle flickering in a storm. I don't know what's worse, the truth or the emptiness, if all this turns out to be a mistake. Lucas didn't respond. He silently prepared the samples. Handing her a swab, he carefully instructed her on how to collect the cheek cells. Lila followed each step slowly, deliberately, as if every motion carried a quiet prayer. When it was done, Lucas carefully sealed the samples in a special envelope. He sat staring at it for a long time, anxiety rising in him, an emotion he thought he had long since learned to suppress. Walter entered, holding a thick winter coat. Though in his 70s, he still moved with the sharpness of someone shaped by hardship. "All finished?" he asked. Lucas nodded and handed him the envelope. "Please deliver it to the private lab I mentioned. Avoid main roads, and tell no one about this, not even my lawyer." Walter understood. He took the envelope. His eyes flicked briefly to Lila, filled with quiet sympathy, regret, and a fatherly sorrow, like a man watching a child step into a difficult fate. "Do you want the results by email or hard copy?" Walter asked. "Both," Lucas replied without hesitation. Walter nodded, pulled on his coat, and left the mansion, leaving Lucas and Lila in the vast room behind. The door clicked shut with a sound that felt like the end of the lies. Outside, snow kept falling, and the howling wind made the windows shiver. The rest of the day passed in near silence. Lucas and Lila barely exchanged a word. Each retreated into their own corner, lost in thought. Lila sat by the living room window, staring into the whitewashed garden, her fingers tracing the edges of her mother's old journal. The words inside pounding like a second heartbeat in her chest. Lucas stayed in his study, trying to bury himself in real estate documents and spreadsheets. But numbers felt meaningless. Images of his father, the lies, the sight of his mother crying behind locked doors, and Miriam walking into the rainstorm kept flashing through his mind, black and white reels he couldn't erase. By late afternoon, Walter returned, covered in white snow, his face pink from the biting wind. "I handed it directly to the lab director. They'll prioritize it, but it'll take at least 5 days for cross-checking and confidentiality." Lucas nodded his thanks, the weight in his chest growing heavier. Lila only gave a slight nod before quietly retreating to her room. Night fell fast and the wind picked up, sweeping thick waves of snow across the region. The radio warned, "A severe blizzard is moving through the area. All highways are closed. Authorities advise against all travel." Inside the mansion, the wind howled like a beast, and oak branches scraped the gray roof tiles. Walter secured the windows and stocked the fireplace with extra wood. The entire mansion took on the glow of a warm but isolated refuge, an island in a frozen sea. Lucas, oil lamp in hand, checked every window one by one. He ran into Lila in the hallway. They paused and looked at each other, eyes wary, but also quietly understanding. No words were exchanged, but both knew they were now stuck here together for at least a week. Walter made hot tea and placed 3 mugs on the living room table. "We'll need to ration supplies, stay warm, and wait this out," he said with quiet firmness. Outside, snow poured down, delicate flakes shattering against the glass. Inside, the only sounds were the ticking clock, the crackle of firewood, and the breath of those within. Lucas sat silently, looking at Lila. For the first time, he no longer saw her as a stranger, but as a secret he had always carried, a missing piece forced upon him by fate that he could no longer ignore. Lila stared down into her cup, hands wrapped around it tightly, her eyes distant. "Have you ever thought," Lucas finally spoke, voice low and rough, "what if we really are siblings?" Lila looked up, startled. "I don't know. Maybe I'd resent my mother for letting me grow up without a father, for never telling me the truth. But maybe I'd be grateful too for keeping me, despite everything she endured." Lucas said nothing. He understood too well the pain of growing up in a home where every truth was locked behind closed doors, where unnamed wounds festered in silence. The blizzard roared harder. Occasionally, the windows shuddered violently from the gusts. Cell service was down, internet gone. Walter brought out an old radio and played soft jazz. The lonely saxophone notes drifted through the storm, haunting yet strangely comforting. The 3 sat by the fire, sipping tea in silence. They knew in the days ahead, Whether they liked it or not, they would have to face the silence together. There was no more running, only the truth, and themselves. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Lila, too, was awake. Maybe she sat by her window, waiting for something no human should ever have to bear alone. For the first time, Lucas felt fragile, alone. Around midnight, the power went out. The fire dimmed. Walter lit the last of the winter candles, placing them one by one throughout the house. Lila sat at the old piano, her hands resting on the keys but not playing, just sitting quietly, as if listening for her mother's voice to echo from the past. Lucas stood outside the doorway, watching her silhouette cast against the wall, a fragile, resilient shape. He didn't enter. He simply stood there in silence, witnessing something sacred. In his heart, something stirred, fear, hope, and a longing to be forgiven. Outside, the blizzard raged on. Inside, three people, each burdened with their own loneliness, were forced to face each other, and the wound's truth was about to lay bare. That night, a draft whispered through the cracks like a voice from the past, murmuring to Lucas, "Bloodline is a thin thread, but enough to change a life forever." Outside, the snowstorm still raged, blanketing Thorn Manor in an icy white shell. All communication had been cut off. The mansion became an isolated world, inhabited only by Lucas, Lila, and Walter. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each day passing as quietly as a hidden river beneath the ice. From the very beginning, Lucas and Lila kept their distance. At breakfast and dinner, they rarely sat at the same table. Lucas kept to himself, using work as an excuse to remain holed up in the second-floor study. Lila wandered the empty halls, her footsteps slow and quiet, fingertips grazing the cold walls, eyes searching for forgotten traces. To her, everything here was unfamiliar. The house had only ever existed as a shadow in her mother's memory, a place of trauma, where Miriam had been exiled from Harold Thorne's life and forced into silence. For Lila, every room, every hallway was steeped in unspoken things, secrets left unnamed. She had no childhood memories here, only years of growing up in a cramped apartment with her mother in a distant city, under the weight of judgment and unanswered questions about who her father really was. Those winter nights, her mother would sit at the piano, tears silently falling on the ivory keys. Lila had learned to play, not to perform, but to be close to her mother, to reach for the sorrow she could never say aloud. On the first day, Lila barely spoke to anyone, besides the occasional thank you when Walter brought tea or warm bread. Lucas didn't appear in front of her at all. The tension was thin but palpable, like mist in the air. No one acknowledged it, but both felt it. At night, the vast house grew colder. The wind slammed against the windows. The firewood crackled softly in the hearth. Lila sat in the living room, fingers resting on the piano, quietly playing a melancholic piece her mother had once taught her. Occasionally, she stopped mid-song, fearing she was disturbing the ghosts that might still linger in this place. Lucas stayed up late, walking the upstairs hallways, his gaze falling silently to the living room below where Lila sat, small and solemn in the shadows. He felt the house breathe differently now, as if her presence had stirred something long buried. It reminded him of his own mother, who had once lived here like a ghost, haunted by power and silence. On the third day, they crossed paths in the kitchen. Both hesitated, unsure of what to say. In the end, Lila spoke first. "I had never been here before my mother died," she said quietly. "I only knew of this place from fragmented stories, and from nights she played piano with tears in her eyes." Lucas sat down at the table, silent for a long moment, before he replied, "I never really felt like I belonged here either. This house is like a golden cage the older I got, the more suffocating it became." Lila gave a faint, sad smile. "There were nights my mother clutched the piano and cried, saying the most beautiful parts of her life were left behind that gate. She never told me everything, but I understood. She had loved, she had dreamed, and she was sold off like a possession." Lucas exhaled. "I never truly understood my mother. She was so quiet, I sometimes questioned if she was even really there. And my father, he controlled everything, our time, our words, our futures. I spent years trying to be like him, only to realize I was just continuing his unhappiness." Lila clutched her tea. We're both victims, even if we never chose to be. The distance between them began to shrink little by little. At dinner, they started sitting at the same table. Walter would sometimes tell stories about Miriam, about the noisy, vibrant years that had vanished as if they'd never existed. On the fourth night, Lila played the piano in the living room. Lucas stood quietly behind her, listening. When the music ended, he said softly, "That piece, my mother used to play it." Lila turned toward him, paused, then replied, "So did mine, but only when she cried." They sat down together by the fire. Silence gave way to shattered memories. Lila looked at Lucas, her eyes shimmering. "I used to think my mother was weak for staying silent, but now I realize she fought in the only way she knew how. I just don't know who I am. Am I the result of a broken love or a dirty transaction?" Lucas's voice was rough. "And I used to admire my father. I wanted to be him, strong, decisive, respected. But now that I know the truth, I feel sick. How could a man preach honor to his child and still do the things he did? I used to think he was the light. Now I see a cold, monstrous shadow." They sat together without another word. But in that moment, the space between them shifted. They were no longer strangers, forced to share a roof, but two children of trauma, just beginning to realize they weren't alone in their pain. On the fifth night, Lila sat at the piano, fingers trembling over the keys. Lucas stood behind her again, the candlelight casting their shadows on the wall. She played a sorrowful melody notes filled with quiet ache, a song that sounded like tears. Lucas sat beside her, truly listening for the first time. When the final note faded, Lila's eyes brimmed with tears. Lucas gently placed his hand over hers, his gaze filled with understanding. "Thank you for staying, for being brave enough to face this place." Lila looked at him, their eyes meeting. In that moment, all boundaries dissolved, only two wounded souls remained, yearning to be seen. Lucas leaned in, almost close enough to kiss her. But Lila pulled away, her voice cracking. We could be siblings." Silence exploded between them. Lucas froze, withdrawing his hand. Lila rose to her feet, tears streaming down her face as she fled to her room, running from the feelings she could no longer contain. That night, Lucas lay awake, haunted by questions of bloodlines and emotions that refused to settle. He didn't know whether to hope for the DNA results or fear them. He couldn't stop thinking about Layla, a woman who was once a stranger, now a splinter lodged in his heart. Lila couldn't sleep either. She sat by her window, clutching her mother's small piano. Memories, dreams, and pain seemed to rise from the wood and mingle with her conflicted emotions, for Lucas tender, fragile, and terrifying. Outside, the snow kept falling, the storm kept howling, as if determined to bury the past for good. But inside Thorn Manor, two souls had begun to find one another despite fear, despite the fragile thread of blood driven by a desire to live honestly, to break free from the shadows of power and silence. That morning, the skies over Haven Ridge were strangely calm. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind thick white blankets over the oaks, the back garden, and the tiled roof of Thorn Manor. Pale sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting a glow on everything it touched. But inside Lucas Thorn, the shadows had yet to lift. He stood at the window, eyes fixed on the path leading to the front gates where Walter had just returned, holding a sealed envelope stamped with the insignia of the private DNA testing center. Behind him stood Lila, silent as a shadow. She hadn't said a word since waking, only brewed tea and sat quietly on the sofa in the drawing room. Her face was composed, but her eyes held the stillness of an ocean just before a storm breaks. Walter placed the envelope on the table, his voice rough, nearly choked. "I got the results directly from the lab director. This is the official copy." Lucas picked it up, his fingers tightening around the edges. Every line he had rehearsed, "Whatever it says, we'll face it together," vanished. All that remained was the pounding in his chest. He tore it open and pulled out the documents. The words were crisp, clinical, sharp as a blade. No biological relationship between Lucas Thorn and Lila R. Hale. Lucas gripped the paper, his vision blurred not out of fear, but from an emotion he couldn't yet name. For days he had lived under the weight of his worst fear, that his feelings for Lila were forbidden, that his father had left behind an irreversible tragedy. But now with one line, the chain snapped. He exhaled, almost laughed through the tears. We're not, we're not. Lila remained still, her gaze distant. Her shoulders didn't shake, but her hands were tightly clasped in her lap. For Lucas, it was relief. For her, it was an echoing void. Her voice came out dry and low. So, my mother truly believed I was Harold Thorne's child. She carried that belief to her grave. And I spent my life thinking my father was the kind of man who could sell my mother for a business deal. Lucas looked up, his voice steady and low. It wasn't your fault. No, Lila shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't my fault, but it was my mother's choice. She lived her whole life in fear and silence, and she let me grow up in the shadow of a man she despised. Do you know what that does to a person? Lucas didn't answer. In her eyes now was disappointment, sorrow, and a quiet fury not toward him, but toward the woman she had loved more than anyone, yet never fully understood. She stood, walked to the corner where her small suitcase sat. From it, she pulled out an old tape recorder, worn plastic casing, a small crack at the edge. She held it up. My mother gave me this before she died. She said, when you know the truth, listen to it. I never had the courage to press play. Lucas stepped forward and sat across from her, saying nothing. Lila set the recorder on the table, took a deep breath, and hit play. A burst of static came first, then a voice aged, emotional, unmistakably Miriam. Lila, if you're listening to this, I'm no longer with you. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell you everything while I was alive. I once loved, but I was sold. Not because I was weak, but because they thought I didn't have a voice. I begged, but he looked at me like I was something to bargain with. I don't know who your father is. It could have been Harold. It could have been a stranger from that night. But this I never doubted. You were the most beautiful thing I ever had. I don't want you to carry my chains. Let the truth be a door, not a prison. Live freely, Lila. Live for yourself. The recording ended. No music. No goodbye. Only silence falling like melting snow. Lila folded forward, face in her hands. No sobs, just a quiet collapse. Her whole body tensed as if holding herself together with nothing but will. Lucas turned away, ashamed not only of his father, but of the name he once bore with pride. Thorne. A name that had built mansions and towers and buried souls like Miriam. He spoke softly. You don't have to forgive my father, and you don't have to stay here. Lila lifted her head, her eyes dry but frighteningly clear. I never intended to stay. I came to understand, not to hold on. And now I do. She stood, packing the recorder into her bag. Her gaze swept the room one last time, this place that had represented everything she hated, and now, strangely, had set her free. Lucas stepped forward, wanting to say something, but Lila stepped back. You don't owe me anything, Lucas, and I owe nothing to the Thorne name. But if you ever want to come back, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Lila shook her head, gave him a faint, wistful smile. If I come back, it won't be to find anyone. It'll be to see how far I've come. She turned. The great front door opened. Walter was already waiting outside, beside the salt-covered car. No one spoke. Lila walked steady, without looking back. Lucas stood on the porch, watching her disappear behind the snow-covered trees. The cold bit through his coat, but he didn't move. For the first time in his life, Lucas Thorne felt truly empty, not because he had lost someone, but because he finally understood. He had been part of the same brutal silence that had haunted this family for decades. Lila had left Thorne Manor carrying the truth, the pain, and the courage her mother had never been able to claim. And inside the house, now filled only with the sound of wind rattling against the glass, Lucas knew he had just lost something he couldn't name, but he would never forget it. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. 2 weeks after Lila left Thorne Manor, winter still clung to Havenridge. But inside Lucas Thorne, a different season had begun, the season of reckoning. He sat alone in the grand hall, facing the old piano where Lila once played. The wind still howled against the glass panes, sending the silver curtains billowing. The manor stood silent, as if waiting for something to be declared. On the oak table lay a speech manuscript, 12 typed pages, revised countless times, each word soaked in blood and moral turmoil. Walter stood at the doorway, holding a coat and a file folder. He said nothing, only gave Lucas a look full of quiet support. Lucas nodded, stood slowly, and put on the coat. Today he wasn't going to work. Today he wasn't demolishing a legacy with bulldozers. Today he was breaking it with the truth. The press conference was held at the main hall of Thorn Realty, a glass-walled tower in the city center, long hailed as Harold Thorn's lasting legacy to American real estate. By 10 a.m., dozens of reporters, shareholders, senior executives, and even representatives from human rights organizations filled the room, curiosity etched into every face. Lucas arrived on time, dressed in a plain gray suit, without a name badge or entourage. His expression was calm but resolute. He stood at the podium beside a banner that read, 2025 Strategic Development Announcement. The coordinator began, "Thank you for joining us as we unveil our expansion plans for the Haven Ridge Estate, soon to become a luxury heritage resort." Lucas raised a hand. "Excuse me," he said, voice low and steady. "This press conference will not be about any resort." The room erupted in murmurs. Some shareholders exchanged looks. Lucas turned toward the cameras. "I'm Lucas Thorn, CEO of Thorn Realty, and today I'm here to talk about the truth. There are secrets buried beneath marble floors, under multi-million-dollar contracts, but I can no longer live under a name built on silence and the blood of the innocent. Nearly 40 years ago, at the Thorn Manor in Havenridge, my father Harold Thorn used his power to force a woman into becoming a gift for a business partner. Her name was Miriam. When she became pregnant, he tried to force her into an abortion. When that failed, he staged a theft, expelled her from the house, gagged her with money, and threatened her with legal action. Miriam lived in the shadows. The child she carried was never an heir, but a living witness to everything the world tried to erase. I met that child. I heard Miriam's final words in a recording she left behind, and I saw what was left of a woman, not just broken by betrayal, but erased by silence. The room fell into stunned stillness. Some gasped. Others glanced around skeptical. But Lucas continued. As Harold Thorn's son, I refuse to demolish the Haven Ridge Estate to build a luxury resort. Instead, I'm announcing that the land will be converted into the Miriam Renewal Center, a sanctuary for women who have survived abuse, coercion, and the violence of power. This is not an apology for my father. It is an act to say, dreams died in that house and they deserve to live again. Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters raised their hands, shouting questions, but Lucas gave a brief nod to the coordinator and stepped away from the podium. He answered none of them. That afternoon, an emergency board meeting was called. On the 28th floor, tension filled the air like gas awaiting a spark. The conference table was stacked with copies of Lucas's speech and news headlines that read, "Lucas Thorn exposes shocking secrets behind real estate empire. New Women's Center or corporate rebrand?" A board member slammed the table. "Have you lost your mind, Lucas? You've tanked the company's image. Stock is down 3.2% in 3 hours." Another snapped coldly. "We can vote you out effective immediately. The board won't allow personal emotion to jeopardize shareholder interests." Lucas stood slowly. He pulled a mic from his lapel and connected it to the room's speaker. His voice came calm and clear. "I'm not sorry for telling the truth. I don't care whose reputation takes a hit or how far the stock drops. I care whether I'm still a human being. If you believe I'm no longer fit to sit in this chair, remove me. But I refuse to lead from a seat built on lies or sit atop the broken body of a woman offered up like a trade. I'd rather be fired than rule from silence and blood." The room fell deathly quiet. Some board members looked down. Others clenched their jaws, unable to speak. Lucas didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out, his footsteps firm and final. Back at the manor, Lucas said nothing to Walter. He simply asked him to begin filing the paperwork to rezone the estate. In the coming days, Lucas would reach out to nonprofit organizations, therapists, artists, and survivors to build the Miriam Renewal Center, not just as a building, but as an act of restitution. That evening he stood alone in the study, looking at the large portrait of his father that hung in the main hall. Harold Thorne's face cold, proud still seemed to lecture him on power and control. Lucas stepped forward, removed the painting, and placed it in a box. In its place he hung a simple wooden plaque. For those who were silenced. This place will listen. Lila knew nothing of the press conference. She didn't need to. But far away by the sea with the waves crashing on the shore, she finally played the piano without breaking down halfway through. And though Lucas wasn't sure he'd ever see her again, he understood something now. He didn't need to be forgiven. He only needed to live a life worthy of the truth and worthy of the woman who carried it away. The coastal town of Haven Rock nestled quietly along the Atlantic shore, where rows of white-painted wooden houses lined the sloping road leading down to the soft sand and pine groves. The sea breeze carried a salty scent that slipped through every door, every slightly open window. And it was in this place that Lila Hale found a fragment of peace amidst her inner chaos. She rented a small house with a porch facing the ocean. Every morning, she woke to the sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore and seagulls calling across the gray sky. Lila spent nearly all her savings renovating an abandoned storage shed into a free music classroom for orphans in the area. These were children with sun-bleached hair, cheeks reddened by the sea wind, mischievous eyes that still held traces of deep hurt. Lila taught them each note, each beat tapped on an old wooden piano as if showing them how to reclaim the voice the world once stole. She spoke little about her past. To the locals, she was simply Miss Lila from the music class down the street. No one knew she had once lived in the Thorne estate. No one knew her mother had once been discarded like a bargaining chip, and Lila had no desire to tell them. Until one day, a package was delivered to her front porch. It had no return address but was carefully wrapped, with a small note on the outside. For you and your mother, the woman who was never given a name. Lila opened it. Inside was a restored piece of sheet music, the very one her mother used to play when Lila was a child, now nearly lost due to torn pages and faded ink. Now every note had been meticulously rewritten by hand and printed on thick music paper, with a note at the bottom, restored from the original in Miriam Hale's notebook, by L. Thorne. Below it was a wooden plaque, hand-carved with the words, "In memory of Miriam," the woman silenced. And finally, a short letter in Lucas's handwriting. I won't apologize on behalf of my father. No one has the right to do that for another. But I choose to stand with your mother, and with you. If one note of music can say what was never said, then let this piece be Miriam's voice and my silent companion beside it. Lila held the note, reading it again and again in silence. Her hands trembled as she touched each word, as if feeling the weight of its meaning. She sat down on the wooden chair on the porch, the sunset casting a warm amber glow across her shoulders. The waves still rolled, the ocean wind still swept through her hair, and in that moment Lila cried. Not from pain, but because for the first time she felt a warmth that was truly sincere, not pity, not a forced act of redemption, but a voluntary choice, to stand with those who once had no voice. The next day, Lila hung the wooden plaque right outside the music room. The children asked, "Who's Miriam, miss?" She smiled and replied, "She was someone who taught me how to keep my voice." And in the gentle echoes of the old piano, Lila knew she was no longer alone. Chapter 9. Forgiveness is not forgetting. One early autumn morning, Lila returned to Havenridge. The Thorne estate had taken on a different look. The iron gates were no longer locked, the overgrown vines replaced by a garden of white daisies. On a small wooden sign at the entrance was a new inscription, Miriam Hale Community Center, for women who need a voice. Lila stepped through the stone path, the same one she had walked years ago in cold and pain. Now the place that was once a house of shadows rang with music, laughter, and the scent of freshly baked cinnamon rolls. Inside, each room had become a small classroom meditation, painting, creative writing, and music. Women whose faces once bore sorrow were slowly rising, rediscovering themselves. Some held children, some were middle-aged, and some were young women barely into their 20s. But in all of them, Lila saw what she had once carried, a longing to be heard. Lucas stood in the second-floor hallway, speaking with a group of social work interns. He wore a rolled-up shirt, no longer the cold CEO he once was. When he saw Lila, he paused. They looked at each other across the staircase, separated not by walls, but by memory. Lila spoke first. "The center is more beautiful than I imagined." Lucas nodded slightly. "I only opened the door. The people who walk through it are the ones rebuilding it." She stepped down, and they met at the middle landing. Just two survivors standing face to face. Lila glanced around and said, "I don't know what forgiveness means, Lucas. I still can't name this feeling, but I know there are things that shouldn't be forgotten." Lucas gave a quiet, sad smile. "I don't expect to be forgiven, but if I can, I'd like to build something with you, something where no one has to be silent again." They walked on in silence, past the old room that was once a dark living room, now a dance space for children. Past the kitchen where Lila once brewed tea during a stormy night, now a bakery class for young women. Past the old piano once where Lila played her mother's final melody, now surrounded by small children tapping rhythms. There was no kiss, no promises of love, but the way they looked at each other, it spoke of understanding, of shared purpose. Lila exhaled. "Thank you for not tearing down this house." Lucas responded softly, "Because you didn't tear down your own voice." And that was enough for a new beginning. Not to forget, but to keep moving forward. You're watching Soul Stories, where every tale whispers of love, healing, and hope. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life, and that love often arrives when we least expect it, don't forget to subscribe and be part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. The following spring, the snow had completely melted from Haven Ridge. The roads surrounding the Thorne estate, now the Miriam Hale Community Center, had been newly paved, lined with wildflowers. The towering fences were gone, and the iron gates, once a symbol of power, had been removed. The place had become a safe haven for women who had once lost their voices in life. Lucas Thorne was no longer the cold CEO sitting in a high-rise office. He declined re-election as chairman of the corporation, stepped away from sterile boardrooms, and chose to stay in Haven Ridge. At the center, he taught a special class, not about finance, not about the strategy, but called Ethical Leadership for Business Students. Each week, dozens of university students came to listen to a man who had once been a symbol of power speak about the cost of silence and the danger of turning a blind eye. Lila, too. She brought the old piano from her coastal classroom back to the center and started a community music class for children and women. Music to her wasn't just art, it was a way for voices long suppressed to rise again without needing words. The children danced to the rhythm, and mothers smiled as their hands touched piano keys for the first time in years. The Thorne estate, once a house of darkness, was now filled with light, laughter, and music. The paintings on the walls told stories of healing. One depicted a woman wrapping her arms around herself. Another bore the words, "No one is born to be silent." The room that had once been Harold Thorne's private study, where he kept confidential files, was now a public library filled with books on human rights, culture, art, and psychological healing. On a quiet summer night, Lila sat alone by the piano, candlelight casting a soft glow over her hands. She played her mother's final composition, once lost, then restored, and now reborn as the prelude to hope. The notes rose, brushing against the high ceilings, echoing through a room that was no longer lonely. Lucas stood behind her, saying nothing, just listening. The piece ended. Lila didn't turn around, but she knew he was there. And then, like a voice carried from the past, Walter's words, the loyal old gatekeeper, echoed in Lucas's mind. "Don't go into that house unless you're ready to tear down everything that was wrong, but now you've entered and stayed." Lucas stepped beside Lila. They said nothing. They simply looked at each other, no longer clouded by fear or doubt. In that look, they both understood. The past had been faced. The wrongs had been named. The pain no longer hidden. And from the ruins of a legacy built on silence and power, something had begun to grow, not hurried love, but trust and companionship. Lucas whispered, "This house is no longer the Thorne estate. It's a new home, a beginning." Lila nodded, her eyes shining not with tears, but with something rare: trust. Outside, the night breeze gently stirred the white roses. Golden lights lined the pathway like falling stars. Inside that house sat two people who had once been broken, silenced, and lost. Now they sat side by side. Lila leaned against Lucas's shoulder. His hand found hers. Together they lit a different kind of light, not dazzling, but enough to lead the way. And that house, the one people had once been warned not to enter, had finally become a place worth staying, a place to begin living.